And I have 3 teenage sons who all share a very unique trait. According to our optometrist, we have beat the genetic odds. And all 3 of my teenage sons are colorblind. Apparently, to have one colorblind child in your family is a rarity. To have 2, that's really rare. To have all 3 of my boys colorblind my optometrist was he was pretty excited about it, actually. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with color blindness, my boys get a lot of strange questions from people. People like to walk up to them and say, "What color is this?" Or, "Can you see this?" Or all kinds of funny questions. Now, they can see colors, but as you can see, on the left would be how you would see those vegetables with normal vision, and on the right would be how, I assume, how my boys would see those same colors. So they see colors, they see variance in colors, but they can't see what the rest of us see. 2 of them are sitting right over here. Is that true? Is this? Who knows? Who knows if that's true? Because I don't know how you can see that right now. Thank you. Okay. So anyway, we learned about it when they had their kindergarten eye exam, and since then, they've had all kinds of funny scenarios that this has created for them. But one of our favorite family stories about how we had a tragic fail was about 4 or 5 years ago at Easter. Now, we have a tradition in our family at Easter time. I have 4 kids of various ages, and so we wanted to hide Easter eggs. And we do this every year, and each kid gets their own color Easter egg so that we can hide it with varying degrees of difficulty according to how old you are. It seems like a great system, right? Except that we assigned this particular year, we assigned my son Joshua the color orange. Now, I thought this is not going to be that difficult. Outside, a bright orange Easter egg, and so we hid his Easter eggs, and there was one egg he could not find. Now, can you see it in this picture? Okay, I walked by this bush regularly, over and over, thinking, it's right there, buddy. It is not even underneath something. It is right there. It is this blatant, bright orange egg under a green bush in the brown leaves. Oh, wait a minute. My children's form of color blindness is a red-green color blindness, which means that shades of red and green and brown and, yes, orange can all look very similar. And so my son walked past this bush I don't know how many times. I'm really messing up this microphone situation, right? Fell off completely. There we go. My son walked by this bush and looked directly at the egg at least 2 or 3 times and never saw the egg. This is one of our favorite stories of total parent failure. But friends, I have to say, God is at the work in the world. And I wonder, can you see it? Do you have a similar sight deficiency? It might be obvious to some of us, God's work in the world, and to some of us, we walk right past it. We don't see that he's at work in the world, changing dark into light, and death into life, and mourning into singing. We maybe can't see it. Can you see it? Because there is joy for those who see what God is doing. There is deep joy for us when we can see what God is doing. Now, the first week of Advent, we were asked to wake up. Do you remember that alarm clock that woke us up in the service? And last week, we were called to repent, to turn back to God. And this week, we're going to talk about rejoicing. And in fact, thank you to our Advent family who started us out on our Isaiah passage. In fact, you did such a fantastic job. I think we can just rise for the benediction. Thank you. It's encouraging to me the way God is already speaking to us before even we reach this week about what it means to rejoice. But for some of us, the expression of joy does not come naturally to us. And so our passage in Isaiah today is asking of us, God is at work in the world. There is beauty in the world because of the coming of the Messiah. Can you see it? Do you walk through every day seeing it? Do you notice it? Because there is joy for you if you can. The background of the passage we heard today is actually not what we would expect if you just read this chapter by itself. Because Isaiah came to the people at a time when he had some horrible news to share. The people of Israel were going about their life, and they had no idea that they were about to experience utter destruction. And Isaiah had to be sent by God with a message to say, hey, people, there's this group, the Assyrians, and they are coming to utterly demolish us. The Assyrians were known to be particularly evil and ruthless. In fact, when you were caught and taken as a prisoner of war by the Assyrians, they would put a fish hook in your cheek and tie you together and lead you by a fish hook in your face. Sorry, kids, that's kind of gross. But I mean, they were ruthless people, and these people were coming to demolish, to destroy. This is the news that Isaiah had to bring to them. And in the very midst of that news is this chapter. It's as if Isaiah is saying, there is going to be great destruction and difficulty and challenge and weeping and mourning. But take heart. I want you to see what God is really doing. See what he is doing, because if you can, there will be joy for you in the midst of this suffering. Now, if you sit with this passage long enough, you will see what we heard this morning, that there is a massive contrast going on in this passage. In fact, if you list everything going on, it would fit in either one side or the other. The wilderness, the desert, the weak, the feeble, the fearful, blindness, deaf, lame, speechless, the unclean, ravenous beasts, sorrow. This is the kingdom of darkness. This is the destruction that the people are going to suffer through. And Isaiah says, but wait for it. Because when God is present, he transforms this into something else, something radically different. The wilderness into blossoms, the desert into streams, the weak become strong, the feeble firm. The blind eyes are open, the deaf ears are unstopped, the lame will begin leaping. We will hear singing of the redeemed. They will not be considered unclean. There will be beauty and joy when God is on the scene. Can you see it in the midst of your suffering? Just last year in 2018, in fact, this time last year, what was in the news was that the state of California had been ravaged by wildfires. Do you remember this? In fact, in the year 2018, California had the most destructive wildfire. It had the largest wildfire on history, and it had the most deadly wildfire in history. California was suffering. And this is what their land looked like. But over last winter, they received a record amount of rain. And so by February and March, there was something happening in California that came to be known as a super bloom. And these places in the desert and had been raged by wildfires became this. This was a picture on Instagram that Newsweek posted because it was so stunning. There's other pictures like this next one that are hard to believe. These are real photos of desert areas. What happens when those rains come is that there are seeds that had been laying fallow in the sand and the dirt, who knows for how long. And the rains come and they bring those seeds to life, and we see beauty that is striking. And do you know what happened? I mean, it gets better. It was so intense that this is the picture from space. From space, you could see the stunning beauty, the wilderness that was blossoming, the desert that was coming to life. And as a result, in Mexico, billions of butterflies somehow heard the news, I don't know, and they migrated to California, and people were posting magical pictures of being surrounded by butterflies in the beauty. I mean, it's magical. It's hard to believe this really happened, right? Folks, this is the picture of Isaiah 35. God is saying, I bring a super bloom, people, when I am on the scene. And you might be experiencing suffering, but if you follow me, wait for it. There will be a super bloom that you can't quite even imagine. Do you see it? Can you see it? As you walk through your daily life right now, do you see God at work? Do you see that in the future, if it's not quite all here yet, we will have a super bloom of God's goodness? That the broken places will become whole. That the broken places in you can be whole. This is the good news of the Messiah. This is why we rejoice that he came. The passage goes on to say this: not just that the wilderness shall blossom, but that the burning sand shall become a pool. Now, burning sand, when it's super, super hot, the heat in the air rises from the sand and does funny things to light. And do you know what that causes when you're in the desert? Yes, it causes what we call a mirage. Have anyone ever seen that, like on the highway when you're driving? Or, yeah, I have. I don't live in a desert, but I've seen a mirage where it looks like way off in the distance there's a puddle of water. You've seen this? And if you get up close, the closer you get, all of a sudden it disappears. And you realize, oh, there was no water at all. It was just heat rising from the ground and changing the way things look. I got fooled into thinking there was water. And we hear stories maybe of parched travelers in the desert who are joyful to see a pond up ahead, an oasis, and they get there and there's nothing. I have to say that that is the way it works when we're living in a broken world, isn't it? There are all kinds of things in this world that promise to me that if I pursue this, if I just keep going after it, there is going to be refreshment for me. There is going to be something that I am thirsty for, and I get there and I realize it's not real. And I find disappointment. Maybe that's in a job I thought would change everything. Maybe that's in the grade, if I get the grade point average, it will fix my entire future. Maybe it's a relationship that has become deeply disappointing. People disappoint. But God says, when I come on the scene, it's not a mirage. There are actual pools of water in the desert when I show up. It's a super bloom, people. It's a super bloom. And when the Messiah shows up, it's not just creation that's affected, it's people. And that's why in Isaiah we see the blind are healed, and the deaf are healed, and the lame are leaping. This spring, I broke my ankle, and I was on the couch for 8 to 12 weeks. And the thought of being able to leap, like I could hardly walk to the bathroom, let alone thinking about leaping. And today, ladies and gentlemen, I am wearing heels. Because as bodies do heal over time, I'm glad God made bodies like that, God says, I'm that kind of God. For those of you who thought healing was not possible, I tell you, it is more possible than you dreamed. This is why the Messiah was good news. And when Jesus came on the scene, this is literally what he did for people. He healed their sight. He had the woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years who thought there was no solution for her wound. And instantly, she was free. This is the Jesus that we say is coming, and that should bring us joy. Why would it bring us joy? It brings us joy if we realize we've experienced this kind of healing. And if we don't have joy when we think about the Messiah coming, it's because we don't see what God has been doing. We have forgotten what he did for us. We don't see what he's doing daily. It's easy to forget, isn't it? It's easy to grow numb to what Jesus did for me, especially if I'm someone who's grown up in the church and I've been here for decades or generations, and it's just what we do. It's easy to forget that I was blind, I was lame, I was wounded without Christ. And even as I've followed Christ, I have needed his healing. I have to be honest with you, my last ministry assignment was deeply wounding. There were ministry failures and personal conflicts and the environment I was working in that was just wounding to my soul. And when I met with the leadership team here to talk about coming as an intern, they said, well, why do you want to come? And I said, well, one, it's required for my degree. So there's that part. But I said also, I need healing. My prayer is that this would be a place where I'm healed. And folks, Jesus is healing me in this beautiful community. It'll be so easy for me to check off the papers I'm doing this year, and there are things I need to get done for the church and show up every week and check it off and go home and have my quiet time and not stop and see. I've been following Jesus for years, but I still need his healing. And unless I stop and pause and look for where God is at work in my life now, today, as the Messiah, I won't have joy. Do you see God at work? Do you see him? In this passage, the way it's written, if you study it, indicates the author wanted you to pay attention to something in the middle of the passage. There's something in Bible study, in hermeneutics, very fancy word, called a chiasm, which really just means the structure of the passage has all these parallel things, and in the middle, it comes to a point. And this is happening in this chapter. We see the creation being restored and creation being restored. And we see people being healed and people being healed in the very middle of it. Do you know what it says? this is what the author wanted us to pay attention to. It says this. Next slide, please. Here is your God. He will come save you. This is the focal point of the chapter. Do you see him? Do you see him at work? Because, folks, there is joy for those who can see what God is doing. God came in the Messiah to rescue, and he is still on a rescue mission today in your life. And what he began, he will complete. So we taste it now. But when he comes again, we get the full super bloom. Are you looking forward to that day? Can you see it? Can you see God at work? Sometimes when hard things happen, it's really difficult to see God in it. I had just given birth to our third child. And mind you, I had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And I was terrible. Yes, Lord Jesus. Come, Lord Jesus, is how I felt. I was overwhelmed. This was not my plan. I was a working mom with 3 tiny children, and I plunged into postpartum depression. And just 6 weeks after Jason was born, our family was driving home from a church retreat. And we were driving through the country roads, and it was a beautiful early summer day, and we were driving along at the speed you would on a highway, and all of a sudden, someone pulled out right in front of us, and we T-boned right into their car. And at the time, I was turned around looking at the children, and so I put my arm out to brace myself, and the airbag went off and snapped my arm. It was ugly. It was ugly. I looked down, and my husband looked at my arm. He said, "Oh, that's broken." And I said, yes, it is. And all 3 of our babies were in the van with us that day. The police estimated impact was about 55 miles an hour. And after that, I sunk into a very dark place with God. And the way I responded was I said, "God, where are you? I did not plan to be having this many babies." It sounds funny now, but it was not funny at the time. I was overwhelmed. I was not sleeping. I was trying to figure out how to do ministry. My body was broken now. I couldn't shower. I couldn't change my own kid's diaper. There was nothing. I couldn't do anything for myself. And I was in a dark place with God because it felt like he just forgot about me for a while. And I remember saying, "God, I really thought the deal was that you loved me. Where are you? Because I can't see you right now." And I was really angry about this accident and that God had allowed these things to happen. We were in pain, and I was in a lot of pain. And it wasn't long after that, maybe a month later, that someone in our church approached me and said, "Michelle, I've been meaning to talk to you for a while, and I have been putting it off, but I want to tell you," because when this happened, it had been a church retreat, and so the whole church heard about it and was praying for us. And this person in my church who I didn't know well approached me and said, "Michelle, this kind of stuff doesn't happen to me, but I want to let you know," now this is going to sound weird, but I want to let you know, like don't think I'm weird. I'm not, this doesn't normally happen. And I was like, "Okay, what happened?" And he said, I was praying for your family. And when I heard about the car accident, and as I was praying, I just had a picture of your family in the van. And I was praying healing over you, and I was praying, that you guys would be able to pick up the pieces afterwards, and I was literally praying healing for your arm. And he said, as I pictured you in the van, all of a sudden I saw that it was filled with angels. And he's like, I don't normally, that stuff doesn't happen to me when I pray, but I thought God might want me to share that with you. And that day, I heard God say to me, Michelle, you thought I abandoned you? I saved you. You thought that accident was me being off the clock and letting something horrible happen to you? Do you know what happened that day? I saw you and I rescued you. See, sometimes when we're in the midst of really hard things, it feels like God's not there. And it takes maybe the community or a conversation with God or the scriptures or some worship or something for God to flip it and to say, actually, you weren't able to see that I was working, that I come to rescue, that I am at work in the world and I'm at work in your life right now. I am there. Can you see me? Can you see it? Because if you can, just as Joy shared today, joy will be yours. Joy will be yours if you can see it. Now, you might say, I am someone who really has a hard time seeing God at work. So what if you can't? What if you can't see it? There was a man whose name is Brother David Steindl-Rast, who was born in 1926 in Vienna, Austria. And as a result of being born there, he grew up with some atrocities, as you would imagine, living through both world wars in Europe. In fact, he was a quarter Jewish, and during the Second World War was drafted into the German army. Can you imagine the kind of pain and tension, the things he witnessed during that horrible time of suffering? Eventually, he migrated to the U.S., and in the 50s, he became a Benedictine monk because he loved God. And one of the things he has been come to be known for is his writings on gratitude. And he writes this: the root of joy is gratefulness. It is not joy that makes us grateful. It is gratitude that makes us joyful. Most recently, I heard the famed researcher Brené Brown quote Brother David. In her talking about gratitude, she said that in 12 years of research, 12 years of interviewing people who exuberated joy, do you know what she found? Not a single one of them did not practice gratitude on a daily basis. She said there is no research that is more compelling and conclusive that there is a connection between the practice of gratitude and the experience of joy. So what does that mean? It means when we're having a hard time rejoicing over what the Messiah is doing, then folks, it's time to practice gratitude. And I say practice because it does not come easy or naturally to us to be grateful. It means we have to pause and slow down and see. And sometimes that's hard work. And sometimes it's seeing little tiny things that don't seem significant necessarily. But when we start to pay attention and practice gratitude for even small things, it gives us vision to see where God is at work. It gives us quiet to hear the voice of God say, I am rescuing you. And folks, it gives us joy as a result. And what happens then when we have joy? What is the response? How do you exude joy? How do you rejoice? What does that look like? Well, in Isaiah, we see rejoicing, we see singing, and we see dancing. And I would say that describes this service. I'm joking. There's no dancing. Is there dancing? I would love to see some dancing in this morning's service. But what does it look like the other 6 days of the week? Well, I think that the passage we have in Matthew, Jesus answered that for us. John the Baptist sends a couple of his guys to Jesus. John the Baptist is in prison, and he sends his followers to Jesus to ask a very important question. Are you the guy? Are you the one we've been waiting for? Is it you? They come and they ask him, are you the one? Or should we be waiting for somebody else? And Jesus answers them, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. Go and tell him. Go and tell him what you see. What does joy look like in real life? It looks like going and telling. It looks like going and telling being part of your regular daily life. Maybe you need to go and tell God that you're thankful, but I think it also means what Jesus said to John's followers. Go and tell what you have seen. It should be part of our conversation regularly. And I don't just mean with the people who already know he's the Messiah. For John was someone who wasn't sure. Is he the guy? I don't know. There are people like that in your life. Is Jesus someone I should pay attention to? Is God who he says he is? I don't even really know what I think about that. Is there joy in your life? Because if it is, folks, the next step is to go and tell. Now, this does not have to look like a 3-point sermon outline or a booklet or a track you give. It can be very simple. I have a friend who has a real heart for sharing Jesus with everyone around her. She's pretty gifted at that. But she says, talking about Jesus, going and telling does not have to be complicated. It's like a Venn diagram. There is God's story of what he is doing in the world. There is my story, and hopefully a lot of that overlaps with what God is doing in the world. And then there is my friend's story. And the places where my story and my friend's story overlap is probably why we're friends, right? And there is part of my friend's story that overlaps with God's story that I'm not part of. That's the Holy Spirit's job to help them see that. But there is a spot in this diagram where all three overlap, where my story and my friend's story and the story of God overlap. And folks, that comes up in conversation regularly, whether we see it or not. I think about my friend who was recently struggling because she is a elder care lawyer, and she recently had to be somewhere where there was hospice care happening. And she said, Michelle, it's really, really hard for me to be there. It's really uncomfortable, and I'm not quite sure what to do with myself, and it's really hard. And all I said to her was like, Susie, I get that. I remember when my grandma was in hospice care. And the one thing that really helped me was to know that God was there too, to usher her, to help her across the line. I didn't have to do that. Now, that was it. That was all I had to say. There was a moment in that conversation where my story and Susie's story and the story of God all overlapped. And folks, when we have joy over who God really is and how he's working in the world, we will go and tell. It will show up in our conversations. Maybe going and telling right now is simply inviting someone to one of our Christmas services. It's an easy way to go and tell this season. People are hungry right now. People are open right now. And we have, count them, 5 opportunities for you. Woof. maybe that's a way for you to go and tell. But I have to ask you, brothers and sisters, can you see what God is doing? If that's hard for you, practice gratitude. Can you see what God is doing? Can you see what the Messiah came to do? That it's real. That it's real for the future, but it's real for now. And if so, then rejoice. And then people, go and tell. Go and tell. Amen.